focus, we doing analysis using Microsoft Excel. So for this semester, we're using Microsoft Excel. And the first level is the tables, the Excel tables, which is what we did. And then the second step is then applying pivot tables, which really works with big data. If you have big data, that's when now we should start introducing pivot tables, but it's still within step 4 of the data analytics process, still analyzing data. So let's say if you worked with data that's like, relatively not big, you can just get away with using tables and then just visualizing your data. But however, when you start looking at big data, like want to look at, like millions of rows of, you within maybe a big company, then you start using pivot tables, which is what we'll be looking at today. Okay, so guys, whenever we talk about pivot tables, there's just a bit of, there's a roadmap that you actually need. It's more like learning outcomes in terms of what you need to understand, like overall what they are for and how to, work with them. So first we'll be looking at the foundation, which is really understanding what pivot tables are and why they are very important in terms of data analytics, and also looking at the preparation of pivot tables, which is really the golden rule for cleaning and organizing raw data. So remember, we did the data cleaning tutorial. So all of these come together, although when you look at them, it might seem like, it's just pivot tables, but however, you can't do a pivot table without cleaning your data. Same as the tables that we did the last time, it always starts with data cleaning. Whatever you're going to do, you always need to start with data cleaning. Also building, which is mastering how to insert, the menu and recommended pivot tables, and also the analysis part, which is looking at the summarizing and the formatting and grouping of your insights. So insights is that's what comes out of your data, and then advanced visuals as well. So whenever you would build like an Excel dashboard, I think pivot tables will always be like the back end of whatever you're doing. Like whenever you build an Excel dashboard, you would need to have pivot tables, like housing your data in the background, and then using things like slices. So slices, it helps you to slice your data into different kind of categories. Then also timelines, which is looking at, if you want to trend data, looking at data at a certain period. And then also from pivot tables, you can also visualize your data using pivot charts, which are linked to pivot tables. So that's what we need to look at whenever we talk about pivot tables overall. So guys, also these on Blackboard, you will find these slides and course slides, I think, on Blackboard, so that you can use also for the one that we did the last time. So they're also there on Blackboard. So you can always go back and access those there as well. Okay, so overall, guys, what is a pivot table? So really, over here, this is just like a snapshot of how a pivot table would look on Excel once you've inserted a pivot table. But really, a pivot table is a data engine. So similar to a car or anything, boat, flight, or whatever that has an engine, that's where everything happens, for everything to move forward or for everything to move left or right. So even within data analytics, so if you had to use a pivot table, it becomes your data engine, because that's where you'll be storing all your data. So whatever you do next is all linked to the pivot table, which really is the engine room for your data. Whatever you do, if you need to insert new data, you would need to refresh your pivot table in order to visualize. If you had like various visualizations, for example, if you built a dashboard with multiple like tabs that are feeding off your pivot table. One pivot table can feed like many tabs, guys. You can like build a dashboard that is dynamic using like the slices. However, when you need to update your data, you would always need to go back to that master pivot table, which is your data engine that houses all your data to make your tweaks and adjustments from the pivot table. A pivot table is an interactive tool that allows you to summarize large data sets instantly, and it really pivots, so the name pivots, or rotates data to help you spot patterns and trends without using a single complex formula. So it doesn't need any formula. So if you had to use like formulas for like, doing big data stuff, you would be doing like complex formulas. But with pivot tables, you just need to connect it to your table. So I would always say that first create a table, then from the table that you've created, which is what we did in the previous lesson, you can then create or generate a pivot table from a table. And then you just have your table as like this master thing that you always update that feeds your pivot table. So you'll always have maybe a tab that has your table on Excel, and then another tab that will then have a pivot table that is fed from the table. So I know it seems like it's like a whole process. However, once you get to understand how the two work, it's not complex at all. So it's like, as I've mentioned, a lens that lets you look at the same data from dozens of different angles in seconds. So you can slice and dice your data by like any field. For example, if you have a column for month or a column for age or gender, or if you are looking at countries or any type of like data point where it's not a figure, like for example, you can look by many different aspects, even like demographics, customer demographics. You can look at data by segments if you had different segments within your data. So you can use that like within your pivot table to drag and drop and like look at your data in different ways. Okay, so let's look at which is section 1, the preparation of your data in terms of a pivot table. So if you remember in the previous lesson, which we looked at doing the tables, it was similar, where you have your range of data within your Excel, and then within the range of data, you need to actually highlight the area where all your data is within in order for you to be able to create the table. So the first step is always to create the table. So that's the first one. You need to make sure it's in a tabular format. And Excel, guys, understands tables better than anything. So Excel needs to know where one piece of information ends and another one begins. And you need to always organize your data in a vertical table format, which is what you're seeing here, where you have like your different kind of columns going, from left to right. And then you have your rows with all your detail going down. So basically that's how you should always, you don't want your table where you have for example, all of these like chocolate, biscuit, whatever running on your columns, like, because now it'll think all of those things are like your headings for like a field, but rather you want to have headings in the columns rather than, having other stuff like your detail. Like you don't want to have like numbers and like sales within the columns here on top. So as I've mentioned, your columns should represent categories. For example, it should be a date, a region, a country, or like customer number, or surname or name, student number. So categories of things that can be grouped together. And then your rows should then represent individual records. For example, if you're working for a retail company, it will be a transaction, customer transactions. Maybe the name of the column, you'll call it customer transactions. And then going down in terms of your rows will be transaction number 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, going down until the end. So basically, that's the general rule of organizing your data within a table. So the second rule, you need to have unique single headers. So I think this is, it's kind of like also a repeat from the previous one where we spoke about the tables, but it's basically, it follows on. So the principles of data analytics that don't change. Like if we're working with a table, that table, we still use it to generate a pivot table. So you need to have one header row, only use a single row for a header. You can't have like double rows. It will confuse your data engine, because Excel is intelligent in that way that it will always say, so if you look at this thing that is ticked here, it says my table has headers, meaning it will be the first top row, which is that row number 1, will always be your header. But I mean, even if, like, let's say you had like a sheet where you had like multiple tables, but within the range of data, if let's say your table started in row 9, but your range of data, you always want the first row, the top row, to be your headings. So wherever even if it's not like in row 1, because you could have like a sheet with multiple tables, but always the top row of wherever it is within the range needs to be your header row. And then unique labels. Every column must have a unique non-blank label. So if it's blank, it won't be recognized within the data engine because it will think it's nothing. So you need to make sure that you give your header a name, and Excel uses these as fields. So we use these words, guys, interchangeably: column, fields, or sometimes it's called variables. It really means the heading name. What is the heading name? That's what it really means. And then no blanks. So you should ensure there are no blank columns or rows within the data set range, because also when you start having blanks, your data won't be aggregated correctly. Or sometimes you might even have like, errors, but you won't really get the full story. So you need to make sure, and you make sure you take care of the blanks during your data cleaning, so that whenever you come at the point where you're doing your tables or your pivot tables, you're no longer worrying about now like looking at blanks or whatever. So it's quite important that you follow the process. So the third rule that you always want to follow, you need to eliminate merged cells. So you need to stay away from merging cells. So even if maybe you got the data from somewhere else, someone sent it to you, or you downloaded it from like an IT platform from your company, because that's what really happens. If you're an analyst working in marketing or sales or wherever, the data really sits with, in the data warehouse, which is the IT guys but IT guys don't really look at the data. Is it clean? Is it workable? They just make sure that data is coming in. Or if you're working in retail, they want to make sure that the till or the point of sale system brings the data. So if a customer scans a product, they want to make sure that the data comes to the data warehouse and it sits there. But you as an analyst, the one that's going to use the data to report back to business, whenever you download the data, sometimes you could find merged cells, you can find blanks, you can find dirty data. So that's where all of these, they come within the data cleaning step. So you need to make sure. So it's a danger. Merged cells are the primary cause of pivot table errors. So errors are quite prominent, where you'll get like weird numbers after doing a pivot table. They prevent Excel from accurately identifying the boundaries of a column, because now if you've actually merged two cells, it doesn't know if is it one cell or is it two cells. So you need to make sure you're keeping it simple. Always use centered across selection if you need the visual effect of merging cells without the structural damage. So for example, you can just like center it or like make it large, like in terms of the wording itself, instead of like really merging cells. Like, I don't know why you would need to merge cells within a pivot table, but yeah, if you needed to. So just another pro tip, you need to unmerge all cells before starting your analysis to ensure structural integrity. So basically, that's what you need to do. Okay, so there's also the power of move. So in terms of whenever, I think this is also similar when you start a table, when you, for example, if you go, so this is just another snapshot. If you go within your data and then you just press Control T. So Control T, it allows you to select. So before creating a pivot table, select your data and then press Control T. This creates the dynamic table, which we've already done in our previous one. And then really the advantage here, if you add new sales data to the bottom of your sheet, then the pivot table will automatically include it when you click refresh. So you don't need to reselect your range. So hence I always say, but you can also create a pivot table without like doing a table. So let's say if you had like just a range of data, then you selected the range of data, then you just say generate pivot table from insert. Then you can also do it that way. However, that way won't be automatic in terms of if you need to update your data, you would then need to paste your data in that range, then go back again and reselect that whole range of the new data. However, if you create the table with the data, the table will take care of updating the data. So whenever you paste the new data within the table then integrates the data within it. Then it feeds it directly to the pivot table. You just need to press refresh within the pivot table, which will then allow it to, bring in that new data that you've just pasted in. Okay. So looking at building your pivot tables. Okay, so this is just a typical example of, or like a snapshot of how a pivot table looks. So this would be a range of data. Then if you had to like insert a pivot table, it would then look like this, basically. So you can like try it out, but we'll also do like in the coming lessons, we'll be then doing like practical things within the class, creating pivot tables and looking at different ways of, analyzing the data. But yeah, so if you're unsure of how to arrange your data, you can always let Excel suggest a layout. So you just need to go to Insert and Recommended Pivot Table. So that's a great thing about Excel. So I know people always talk about AI and this, but guys, Excel has always used inverted commas AI, like in terms of predicting what you want to do, because it understands it so much in a sense that by you just hovering within the range and going to recommend a pivot table, it will then highlight your whole range and say, okay, this is where your whole range of data is. Here's a pivot table. So you can either click it, manually or click on the suggested pivot table. And you can see next to it is the table. So, but as I've said, the table is just straight. Keeping your data, pivot table will allow you to maneuver your data, slice and dice in different ways. So that's where you'll go and insert your pivot table. So Excel scans your headers and data patterns to offer common summaries like sum of revenue by region or count of orders by category. So Excel will always do that for you. You can also do a manual creation, which I've spoken about. So here you have total control. You need to select insert, pivot table for a blank slate. And then you need to choose new worksheet to keep your raw data and your analysis separate. So if you had your analysis, for example, in another sheet, you would then say insert pivot table, then say choose new worksheet. so that your pivot table doesn't sit in the same sheet that has your data. Because, for example, if your data is like big, you don't want to have a pivot table now also in that same tab or sheet. You want to create a new sheet, which will then just house your pivot table separately. So yeah, this opens the fields pane. So this is a fields pane where really the fields, remember, are your columns. So you'll be able to see your columns over there on the right, which acts as your workshop for dragging and dropping data categories. So for example, if I wanted to create a pivot table, I would literally just go, this is last name and name. I could drag this onto like this sheet thing, and then it will bring up that column with either numbers or text, depending on what type. So if it's last name, it will probably bring people's surnames up. Then if you needed to then bring in like values, you would then use like values for sales or whatever. If you wanted to look at sales, maybe monthly sales, you would then bring in from here the fields, you would bring in month. Then in terms of the values, you would then drag whatever sales into the values. So you'd also go on the fields pane and then drag sales into the values. Then it will show monthly sales. Okay, so basically, yeah, this is the engine room. So remember, pivot tables is the engine. So using the analogy of like a car or whatever that has an engine. The field list pane contains your column headers. So those are your column headers, and dragging these into the 4 boxes below. So you have 4 boxes below defines the structure of your report. So for example, as you can see here, you have columns. So this says columns on the top right. And then on the bottom left, it says rows. So if you wanted to do a pivot table where on the columns, which is what's running on top, you want to have month, you would then drag month into column. Or sometimes you want to see like months running down maybe the rows, and then you would then have, maybe if you're building like a time series thing, you can then put like your month under row, where you have your months going down 1, 2, 3 until 12. You have 12 months. And then going to the right, you can then have maybe your, I don't know, like your sales. But yeah, basically it's, you would then decide as an analyst, because the way that you arrange your pivot table will also dictate how your visualization looks. So it's always a trial and error. For example, if you want to see a certain visualization and then you start doing your pivot table and it doesn't come out the way that you want, you can always go back and adjust how your pivot table is, which will then adjust your visualization until you get the one that you want that tells a story. And then if the pane disappears, you simply click anywhere inside your pivot table to bring it back, or check the pivot, or check the, like, go and click on the, you need to check the pivot table analyze tab. So if you go there, there's the pivot table analyze tab, which you can always go and then bring up your pivot table analyze kind of, because let's say you are working on the pivot table, then you click on the side, this will disappear. But then now, whenever you want to adjust anything, you need to bring it back. So these are the 2 ways that you can bring it back in essence. Okay, so looking at the areas, so we have filters and we have columns. So if I just go back, as you can see here, there are 4 blocks. This one says filter, this one says column, the one on the bottom left says rows, then the bottom right says values. Cool. So the filter area. So here, this is where you apply global filters to the entire table. For example, you can drag year onto the filter to view the whole report by 2024 only. For example, if I've already done an analysis that has, for example, if my data includes 2020 data from 2020 up to 2026 at an overall level. However, if I only want to look at my data for 2024, I can then go to like my pivot, like options, and drag a year onto filter, and then only filter the data by 2024, which will then change my whole pivot table to become the year 2024 alone. So basically, that's how the filter works. So you can filter either if you had like maybe another category could be males and females. It could be first, second, third, fourth year. You can only look at a specific, or you want to look at a certain brand alone. If you're working maybe for Amazon or Takealot, you want to only analyze, I don't know, like Nike or Adidas or Superbalist as a brand. And then the column area. So here, fields here are displayed horizontally. If you had to drag something onto the column area, and it's perfect for comparing trends across categories or regions side by side. So basically trends, it's anything that like moves along with time. For example, if you wanted to show like a bar graph with like, you know, months going from left to right, you would then use the column area. Or like if you wanted to look at like regions, maybe if you're looking at provinces in South Africa, you wanted to compare all the 9 provinces in terms of sales, you would then drag your region or province field onto the column, so onto that top right. You would then go and drag it onto the top right to have it compared in terms of next to each other whenever you want to visualize it. So basically, guys, you can see how I'm talking. I'm already visualizing how I want the end state to look, which is really your data visualization. So whenever you do a pivot table, you should always have that in mind that, okay, how is this going to be visualized? Because I know sometimes you might be tempted to say, this looks nice and complex. Let me, look clever, but the clever thing will look very silly in a visualization because you want your visualization to be very neat and clean and free of clutter. So you want it to be basic as much as possible. You don't want to, for example, if you want to show sales by province, I would suggest maybe having one visual that will only speak to sales by province. You don't want to add the profit there as well, the units there as well, unless those have a relationship together. For example, you can put sales and maybe sales contribution, or let's say you wanted to look at sales amongst different product categories. If you're working at Takealot to Amazon, to say, okay, which product categories generated the most sales? And then we also want to look at the percentage of what each product category has contributed to the total sales. Then that makes sense, where you have a visualization that is going to have sales, and then that's also going to be linked together with the percentage. So there is a way to kind of show, maybe you have your sales as a bar in a bar graph, and then you can have your percentage as like I don't know, like sometimes you can do like a trended line, or like, because that will become a percent. So it won't be in the same scale as your sales. So basically, that's what you need to think about. Then the area, which is the bottom left, is the rows area. So fields here are displayed vertically. So vertically is going down from up, down. So if you put something there, that's how your data is going to look, from up, down, like it's in a column. This is the primary way to group your data. So such as by customer name or by product. So if you wanted to look at your data in that sense, that's where you would then drop your field list, or like your field within the field list. And then within the values area, so the values area is there. So as it says, it's anything that's a value. So this is where the calculation happens. So you drag numbers here to see sums. So that's where the statistics happen, actually. So there's different types of stats in terms of functions. You can sum, you can average, you can count, you can find the min, you can find the max, you can find the mode, you can find the range. So similar to what we looked at when we spoke about the tables. So it's the same kind of stats that you can also see on a pivot table. So you can look at an average as well. So basically, you can standard deviation, but you need to understand why are you using the stats that you're using. So guys, it's important to always understand. I always say what we've done before we came to fourth year is what you need to always remember, because you've done stats maybe in second year, but all of these are coming back. It's things that you should be aware of, basically. So even when you're doing like total sales, you need to know, okay, if it's total sales, I need to sum. If I'm looking at, I don't know, like if it says a mean of the customer purchases, a mean and an average, it's more or less the same thing, looking at a mean on average. Or if you wanted to count how many things you've sold, how many milk cartons have we sold as a retail company or as a farm or wherever we are, then you would then use count. Okay. Then now analyzing the values. So looking at summarizing and formatting for professional impact. So whenever we calculate, so we have, as I've mentioned, the types of calculations. So Excel by default, guys, whenever you do like a pivot table, it will sum anything that's a numerical value. It will sum it, even if that numerical value is for example, a date becomes a text. So even if like the numerical is sales, or if it's a number of days, like anything that is like, like a numeric, it will sum it. Even your percentage. So if you got like data that already was calculated as a percentage, and then you bring it onto a pivot table, by default, it will sum. It will like calculate all of the like percentages. So you need to now go back and say, no, actually, I want to average here. I want an average, or I want to, and then it will count everything that's a text. So if you put anything that's a text in the values field, it will count it. For example, if you want to know how many females bought a certain thing, you would then put like females on the column. Then you would also need to put that same female field on the values so that you can know how many females like participated or bought something overall without even looking by product or anything. So basically, that's always the two defaults that Excel will always do whenever you're doing a pivot. So you don't take everything by face value because you're like, oh no, I've generated a pivot table, so now everything is all right. You still need to go back and do further work to say, okay, how has Excel aggregated my data? Remember, we spoke about aggregating, which really is summarizing your data. So you can aggregate it using all these different types: sum, count, average, max, min, range, mode, and all the different types of functions that you can, statistical functions. Okay, so professional formatting. So this is just a number format tip. So you should never format cells using the home tab within the pivot table. Instead, you should right click a value in the table and select number format. So for example, so as you can see here, now you're currently in your pivot table, but you are also, because Excel also allows you, for example, if you wanted to maybe change a number into a currency. So if we were using a range within our Excel sheet, we would go to our home and change it in, so maybe let me just, I know I have this vision, just to, maybe you're not seeing the vision. So let's say you had the pivot table. So if I had my data here, so I can change, because this is the home tab. I can change my thing here and say, okay, I want this to be currency. I can change it here. However, if you're working with pivots, you should change it within your pivot table, because when you go within your values, for example, if this is total amount, you can click on this thing, which will then allow you to, which will pop this thing up, which will then allow you to change. And then you can, by changing this, it will then change it for the whole data set. It's not like if you do it the other way, you always have to change it whenever you're visualizing, whenever you bring up a different summary of a pivot. So you'll always need to change it. But then if you change it within the engine of the pivot table, whenever now you start analyzing by the total amount, it would already do it for you. For example, if you wanted to be show value as a, so here it's either you can say summarize it by average, or you can say count, or you can sum everything. And then you can also say show value as. So that's where you will select, I want my value to be shown as a number. I want my value to be shown as a date. I want my value to be shown as a currency. So you should actually make all the changes within the engine of the pivot table. So this ensures that you add new data, or whenever you add new data or refresh the table, your currency symbols and decimals will always be in place every time. So basically, that's how you would format. So we're still, guys, gonna, in the coming lessons, we then gonna get our hands dirty, really work at an exercise where we're doing the changes within the pivot table. So this is just painting the picture, which is very important, by the way, the theoretical foundation. Okay, show value as. So for example, so behind, beyond the row, the raw numbers. For example, if you want to see market share, so guys, you should always show your values. So this is maybe like a pie chart with like market share, which is showing a percentage of a slice. Maybe this is a certain company and this is another company. So all you need to do, for example, if you've visualized, or if you've done like a pivot chart, you then need to just right click and say show value as, and say percent of grand total. So it will always be as so somewhere here. If you say show value as, you can then from there say, you can click an option that will say a percent of grand total. So you don't need to calculate everything one by one. You can also say a percent of whatever, but you need to know, okay, am I looking at the grand total? What am I really looking at? And this transforms your, for example, your 1 million into 65%. So if this was like a number, for example, if it was sales, 1 million here, maybe here it's like 300,000, then it will then convert that into percentages without you even calculating it, by just selecting, making it much easier to communicate the impact to stakeholders. So basically, once you make sure your data is working well within the pivot engine, then you start, changing things dynamically. So you also master grouping within pivot tables, which really speaks to time series analysis. So here you right-click any date field in your table and select group. So for example, if you had like a field of like, if you had like different data, for example, if you had like quarters and months, or like, you would then select them, and then Excel will automatically turn, thousands of daily dates into like months or quarters or years, and grouping them together. If you had like transaction days, like going down, so you can like literally do it from there. You can also group numbers, for example, grouping ages into brackets. For example, if you had like many age groups, you can then group those that are between 20 to 30 together, or those that are between 31 to 40 together as well. Okay, so another cool feature, which is really refreshing and maintaining your, so now you've already done it, you've already done your pivot table once, but if you're within a company, there's always data every week. So you need to maintain the data, you need to refresh the data. So what do you do? So there's something called cache. So cache, not like cache, but cache is like data that's being stored. There's a cache secret and understanding what the cache is. So a pivot table doesn't look at your sheet in real time. So that's an important thing. So once you, for example, if you have your table, you generate a pivot table from your table. That's the last time your pivot table will ever reference the table, because it has taken a snapshot, so it's 100%. It's a snapshot of that table at that point in time, and it has then kept it in its engine, where you can now do like various things. So it takes a hidden snapshot called the pivot cache, and then this makes the table incredibly fast. But it means if you change a price in your source data, the pivot table won't know until you tell it to look at it again. So basically, if now I'm working in retail and then every day or every week I need to update the data, if I've created the pivot table and now I've got new data, I need to first do my table and make sure my table is complete, then go back to my pivot table and click refresh in order for the pivot table to now pull in that new data that has been added. So basically that's the cache secret within the pivot table. And then refreshing your data, so stay up to date. Whenever your source data changes, you must update the table. You need to right click anywhere within the pivot table and select refresh. So for example, if you had so this is just a snapshot. If you had like a pivot table, you could literally right click on it and something will pop up like a menu, and then there's going to be an option that says refresh. Then you just need to click refresh and it will refresh everything. And if you have multiple tables across different sheets, you need to go to, for example, as I've mentioned, you can have multiple tables that are feeding this pivot table. You would then need to go to the data tab within your ribbon. So your Excel ribbon, there's a thing called data there, and just say refresh all to synchronize your entire workbook at once. So if you are running like a dashboard with like multiple tabs, you would then need to do that, where you update everything within that space. Okay, so looking at, so this is like towards the end, the advanced visuals within. So there's something called a slicer or slicers, which is really a visual filter within. So this is an example of a slicer. If you had like a pivot table here, and then if I click on one thing like this Bartman thing, it will then filter this whole pivot table. Like it will start, it's like a selection thing where the whole data will start being dynamic based on what I'm pressing. So if I'm pressing like maybe a product category, it will then only show me whatever I'm pressing. So that's what the filters do. Slices are professional buttons that anyone can click to filter the report. So it's also used for dashboards. So if you want to like select stuff on a dashboard, and they are far more user-friendly than the standard filter drop-downs. And how do you add them? You need to go to your pivot table analyze. So there's like I think it was like somewhere within your pivot, pivot table analyze, you would go there to be able to find the to find the slicer, and then you need to then go insert slicer, and then you would choose which fields or columns that you want to include. So for example, if you wanted to add a slicer by region, a slicer by product category, you can add a slicer by maybe gender, age, and then it will then appear. Either you can then start dragging them either below your pivot table or to the side. And when you click on any of them, it will start dynamically changing your whole pivot table, really. Okay, so timelines. So the time traveler. So what is a timeline? So a timeline is a special slicer specifically for dates. So it allows you to drag a slider to filter your data by days or by months or by years with ease, basically. So it's like so the previous one is like you click on it. So if you had to use the timer on the timeline, you can like literally, it's like a sliding scale, which is just, just would show you if it's like Q1 to Q2, and then it will then dynamically change your data according to that. And then we also have pivot charts, guys. So I've spoken about the charts. So the charts you can also get from pivot charts. I mean, the pivot table, you would literally just need to click on the pivot table. So these charts are always linked to your pivot table. And when you filter on the table, so imagine if you had a chart from the pivot table, then you also had a slicer. Whenever you click on the slicer, it will then also dynamically change your chart based on what you are currently filtering. It tracks trends. It's also good to compare categories and also show proportions or percentages. So yeah, guys, so this is just an example, so a real world example of, for example, if this was a pivot table. So this summarizes 3,000 transactions into 4 simple rows, identifying London as the top revenue region. So this was, for example, 3,000 transactions from like customer data that now we've just, simply, if we wanted to present to the CEO or like, management or the head, you don't want to be showing them like 3,000 transactions within your Excel. Be like, what is this? So you need to make sure you can create these kind of summaries with just, bring everything together. But yeah, guys, that was the theory. So yeah, so sorry, some shortcuts to master. So you'll get this, guys. So you'll be able to do this. The instant shortcut to insert a pivot table, Alt plus N plus V, or Alt plus F5. That's a one-touch refresh if you had a pivot table, or Alt F1, which automatically creates a pivot chart from any selection that you have. And then you need to make sure this is your checklist. Like whenever you are working with them, the pivot charts, is your data clean with no merged cells or blank headers? Did you convert your row data into an Excel table? Are your values formatted using number format? Have you added slices to make the report interactive? And also remember, you always need to refresh when your source data changes.